Why don't we wait another 2 or 3 minutes? People still seem to be coming in.
Are there any handouts to share?
I don't know.
All the presenters will use PowerPoint, so there are no handouts.
Claudia, have they been given permission to share screen?
Yep.
Good. Well, I think perhaps we should get started. Welcome all to Princeton-Bucharest seminar in early modern philosophy. And the subject today is going to be theories of mental representation in early modern philosophy. And I will turn it over to Patrick Connolly, who is going to be chairing this session.
Super. Thanks, Dan. I'm Patrick Connolly. I've agreed to be the chair for our session today. So as we just heard, we're going to have a panel on theories of mental representation in early modern philosophy. And we'll hear from Lauren Slater about Descartes, from Manuel Fasco about Berkeley, and from Peter West about Amo. A few organizational things. So the presenters have decided that they'll all give 15 to 20-minute presentations at the beginning of the session. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end where all of the presenters will take questions. So in terms of organizing the Q&A session, I'd ask we adopt the following procedure. If you have a question for one of the speakers, please use the chat function just to register you have a question. You can type question or Q, and please also indicate who your question is for. I'll do my very best to keep track of the list of questioners, but also to make sure that all of our presenters get some questions addressed to them. So that's the plan for Q&A. I'll introduce our first speaker and then turn the virtual microphone over to her. So Lauren Slater is currently a PhD research student at Berkeley College, University of London. Her research focuses primarily on the philosophical thought of René Descartes, with a special focus on issues relating to sensory perception, causal theories of perception, and representation. So we'll be fortunate to hear some of that today. Lauren is the motive force behind the London Cartesian Circle Research Group, and she's written a number of pieces for Medium, including what I suspect is the very first ever comparative study of Descartes and Billie Eilish. So definitely something to check out. And today we're fortunate to hear her discussing representing representation, Cartesian ideas, and their objects.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Let me just get my slides up. Okie dokie. Can everybody see that and hear me? That's all good. Great. Fantastic. Oh, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you to the organizers, Jan and Claudia, and to my fellow panelists. It's a real pleasure to be talking about this topic with you all this evening. I will just say a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm hoping to kind of set the scene for our discussion this evening. So part of what I have to say, I think, is sort of relatively straightforward, but kind of sets the scene for the theme of sort of representation in this period. So I'm going to begin by talking about ideas. So I think in order to understand what representation might mean for Descartes, we must first look at what he says about ideas. So he offers this description of ideas in the third meditation. So some of my thoughts are, as it were, images of things, and it's only in these cases that the term idea is strictly appropriate. So for Descartes, ideas are a subset of thoughts, and what demarcates ideas from other kinds of thoughts is that they are, as it were, the images of things. So I don't think we should take this to mean that ideas are literally mental images, for lots of reasons, but Descartes notes that we can have ideas of things like duration and number, which we can't really conceive as images. So instead, we should take this to mean that ideas are like images insofar as they contain representative content. So I think an idea for Descartes is something that represents. Okay, so what does it mean for an idea to have representative content for Descartes? And it's here that I want to talk about the way in which Descartes uses this term. There are points at which he seems to use represent and exhibit interchangeably, as in this passage here. So perhaps we can take from this that representation for Descartes is a notion much closer to sort of presentation or exhibition. So rather than representation, which I suppose we typically understand to be a kind of relation between an idea in the mind and an object sort of outside of the mind, the notion of presentation or exhibition seems to capture a kind of an event, a kind of occurrence in the mind when the mind has an idea. There's sort of content presented, ideas present their content. So if we think about it in this way, then ideas are kind of like mental vehicles that present, that sort of carry their objects and present those objects within the mind. And so at this stage, I think it's useful to explore an ambiguity in the word idea that Descartes himself acknowledges in the preface to the Meditations. I think this ambiguity brings to light the dual sense of the word representation for Descartes. So in this passage on the slide here, we have a distinction between ideas taken materially and ideas taken objectively. So it's worth taking the time to clarify what those two things mean. So ideas taken materially are just the ideas themselves, simply as modes of thought. So we should take this to mean that ideas are, in the material sense, are simply sort of modifications of the mind. And it's here that we can think about the passage where Descartes says that ideas are all sort of alike, right? So insofar as they're just these modifications of mind, they're all alike. The way that they differ is in their content. So this leads us to, ideas in the objective sense, or ideas taken objectively. And so these are the things that are represented by the idea. So ideas taken materially are simply the modifications of the mind. Ideas taken objectively are the kind of content, right? The mental content. This is all just, as I say, a kind of setting the scene, a kind of precursor. So I'll move on to the way in which I think that this sort of dual sense of the word idea captures this dual sense of representation. So what is the relation between ideas in the material sense and ideas in the objective sense? So I propose that we should understand that ideas in the material sense kind of present the ideas in the objective sense. So this is more to say that ideas present their content in the mind. So ideas in the material sense sort of represent, as in present, ideas in the objective sense. But this leaves representation as we typically understand it, right? So this leaves the sense of representation where we have an idea in the mind that has a kind of relation to represent something outside of it. So it's related, as in, it represents something outside of it. It's not just sort of presenting content, but there's also this sense where there are two things connected. So representation in a kind of relational sense. This is what we all, I suppose, on this panel this evening are trying to answer. We're trying to make sense of how ideas in the mind represent things outside of the mind. So how do they bear these special relations? How do these ideas have their content? Okay, so there are two ways, again, it's more sort of early modern setting the scene. There are two obvious ways we might think this happens. So one way is resemblance. So when one thing bears resemblance to something else, we might say that it represents it. So we might say that a portrait of Margaret Thatcher successfully represents Margaret Thatcher when it looks like her, when it bears a resemblance to her. Likewise, we might say that a map successfully represents some terrain when it resembles that particular terrain. Another seemingly straightforward way to make sense of representation is to hold some kind of causal theory. So one sort of, it's sort of simplified, but sort of popular version of this kind of theory would say that A represents B if there's a reliable causal connection between A and B. So we might say that my idea of a horse represents horses since it's reliably caused by the presence of horses, something like that. So these are two ways, two avenues we might go down in order to make sense of this relational sense of representation, this sense of, the idea has the content because it's connected to something outside of it. Neither of these, I think, seem to be consistent with the things that Descartes says. Yes, it's now time to unpack that a little bit. So first of all, I should say something about Descartes and sensory perception. Of course, our sensory ideas, our ideas of things outside of us that we sort of get through the senses, or that we sort of at least naively believe that we get through the senses. These are the ideas that we think that the most likely candidates to have this kind of connection with things outside, right? So let's think about what Descartes says about how sensory perception works. So we've got this kind of three-stage account that Descartes gives in the optics. So first, the external object, the object sort of in the world, makes some impression on the body by causing particular movements in the nerves. Second, these movements in the nerves compose a kind of image in the brain. And then third, these brain images occasion or give rise to sensory perceptions in the mind. Of course, sensory perceptions are in the mind rather than the body for Descartes. Okay, so why can't we make sense of either of these ways, these avenues that I described a little bit earlier? Well, first, we can't really make sense of the idea that our ideas represent things outside of them because they resemble those things. And this is because Descartes consistently says that there's no resemblance, there's no similarity between the ideas and the things that sort of give rise to these ideas. Further, this passage in the comments, taken from the comments on a certain broadsheet, really sort of hits that point home. So he says that there's no similarity, and he also says of sensory ideas in particular, the ideas of pains and sounds and colours and so on must be all the more innate, right? They must be all the more internal to us because they couldn't possibly have come from things outside of us, given that they're not at all similar to those things. So he sort of strictly denies that there's resemblance between our sensory ideas and the things that give rise to them in the kind of external world. Causation is slightly more difficult. This might be something that we can talk more about in the Q&A, but the second sort of denial, the denial of the second avenue comes again. This quote is taken from the same passage in the Comments on a Certain Broadsheet, where Descartes says that all our sensory ideas, in fact, all of our ideas, are innate to the mind. So if our ideas are innate to the mind, that means that they're not coming from things outside of us. Right? They exist in the mind only and innately. So we might naively believe that they sort of come to us from external things, but this would be a mistake. So this presents us with a kind of problem. So if sensory ideas are innate to the mind and they don't resemble objects or features of the external world, then what could be their connection with those objects and features? And in what sense could my sensory ideas be kind of about external things, or could represent external things in this way, in this relational way? It sort of seems like the picture painted so far is we have the mind with all its ideas in this kind of quite cut off place. So I want to ask the question about what the connection is between the mind, the body, and the world, really. So my short answer to the question of how are my sensory ideas representing things is that God determines the content of all of our ideas. So God endows minds with these innate ideas that already represent what they represent. But I don't want you to think that's a boring answer. There is way more to say about this. But ultimately, the answer to that little bit of the question, I think, is that God does it. God determines the content of our ideas. But the next question, the sort of the meatier part of the question is that, how are mind, world, and body related then? Right? How should we understand all of these connections between mind, brain, and world? And my answer to this is that mind, brain, and world are all connected within a language-like system. And this ultimately should be understood as a kind of system of representation. So this is the more interesting answer. It's the little add-on to the God did it part. So when Descartes talks about sensory perception, he draws this analogy with language. He draws this analogy over and over again. There are some quotes here on the slide, but he also mentions this language example in the Meditations and the Passions of the Soul as well. So I think it's safe to conclude that this language example is really significant to Descartes. So how does the analogy work? Descartes compares the brain images, the nerve patterns in the brain, to words. And at least one reason for this is to remind us that our mind can be sort of stimulated by things that do not resemble what they signify, they represent. So Descartes' idea seems to be that these brain images are sort of words or signs for the mind. And on the occasion of these words or signs, the mind, through its own power, brings about these sensory ideas. Right, I do have a slide on causation, but I may skip it and we can talk more about causation. I understand it's a very big topic, so I think I might skip it just for the sake of time. We can come back to that. Right, so what can we say about this language analogy? One thing that I think it's really important to stress is that Descartes draws this analogy with words quite specifically in his account of perception. So he's not drawing the analogy with what we might think of as natural signs like smoke and fire. We say smoke is a sign of fire. That's a kind of example of a natural sign. But the way that words are signs is special. And I think this communicates something in addition to the point simply about kind of a causal or a causal-ish relationship between non-resembling things. So I suggest that it tells us that the motions in the matter, the nerve patterns in our brain, are chosen or instituted with purpose by God, right? These are connections that are made intentionally by God. And it also tells us, I think, that in virtue of the fact that our brain images are associated with these ideas that have representational content, it means that they have a kind of derived significance, or a derived kind of meaning in virtue of those associations. Just in the same way that words have a kind of derived representation in virtue of the fact that they are associated with meanings that have a kind of primary representation. Again, I'm sort of whizzing through this, but we can talk more about this in the Q&A too. Right, so this passage is a very important passage for what I'm saying. Here, from this passage taken from the World, Descartes seems particularly eager to stress the features of words as signs specifically. So Descartes writes, if words which signify nothing except by human convention suffice to make us think of things to which they bear no resemblance, then why could nature not also have established some sign? So in this passage, it seems to be kind of particularly important to Descartes that words signify nothing except by convention, right? And he goes on to sort of rhetorically ask, why could nature not also have established some sign? So here the suggestion is that nature, or perhaps more accurately, God, since he equates the two, so as we said, God establishes these signs. God establishes these signs much like human beings do when they establish that words will signify particular things or will represent particular things. So in this passage especially, it seems really key that Descartes chosen to use the example of words rather than other kinds of signs. Right, so he could have used the example of smoke being the sign of fire. If the only point that he wanted to make was that a non-resembling thing can make you think of that thing, then smoke and fire would have worked just as well. But it seems important to him to stress that there are these conventional relationships between words and their meanings. But it's a sort of established convention, right? It has some purpose behind it. And I think that what he's trying to say by this is that the connections between the brain, the body, the brain, and the mind are conventional, but have been sort of established on purpose by God to communicate something specific. So I'll sort of sum up now. I realize that was a great deal to take in. So I hope I've done an okay job at getting through it. In conclusion, ideas represent objects and features of the external world because God determined their content, right? So our ideas have their content because God determines that content. But there's more to be said about this. We should understand the Cartesian sort of human being, the union, as a kind of language system where we can make sense of meaningful connections between the mind, the body, and the rest of the material world. And the mind, brain, and world together form this ultimately sort of representational system. So we can make sense of the fact that, yes, okay, our ideas have their content sort of built in, but that's not to say that they don't bear these meaningful and representational relations with things external to the mind too. So thank you for listening. And yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lauren. As you said, a lot of material, but admirably clear and really exciting. So thanks very much. And also, in terms of language instituted by God, a very nice segue into our next presentation. So our next talk will be from Dr. Manuel Fasco. Manuel is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Basel, where he's pursuing a habilitation project focused on Lady Mary Shepherd. Prior to arriving at Basel, Manuel was a visiting scholar at the Ohio State University and the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. He completed his PhD at the University of Zurich with research focused on George Berkeley. Some of that research won the Turbane Prize. And Manuel's monograph, Die Sprache Gottes, George Berkeley's Auffassung des Naturgeschehens, was recently published by Schwabe Verlag. And you can find other publications of his in Berkeley Studies and in other venues as well. So today, Manuel will be speaking to us about no representation without resemblance, Berkeley's resemblance thesis, and the necessary conditions for representation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. And also thank you to the organizers for having me as well. I slightly changed the title to have an alliteration in there, but the subject will be more or less the same. So can everyone see that? Perfect. Good. So yes, I'll speak about Berkeley and representation. And as Lauren said, Lauren said in Descartes' case, there's an interesting question about the mechanism, and I will be less concerned with the mechanism because, as will become evident in a minute, it's pretty evident what Berkeley takes to be the mechanism of representation. But it's more about the workings and the fine-tuned details of this mechanism. So my talk is entitled Learning from Likeness, Berkeley and the Difference Between Representation and Resemblance, which will also tell us something about the necessary conditions for representation. And as I said, my focus will be on his notion, or Berkeley's notion, of representation. And in particular, I want to clarify what the exact difference between representation and resemblance is by illustrating how complex Berkeley's notion of likeness actually is. And in particular, I will argue or try to convince you that there are at least three groups of likeness relations in Berkeley, or that we can distinguish three groups of likeness relations, and that only one of these is actually really a necessary requirement for representations. So my plan is as follows. I will first provide you with the background on what virtually everyone agrees on who works on Berkeley and the representation. Then I will briefly talk about resemblance, and then I will introduce those three groups of resemblance relations, and finally I will provide you with a conclusion. So the first thing basically everyone agrees on is following Kenneth Winkler's observation that Berkeley uses represent ambiguously. So we already heard this in Lauren's talk that Descartes points to this, that there is more than one way of representing, and that words, for example, represent as well. And Berkeley also speaks this way. So when he uses represent to refer to an arbitrary, or what he thinks is an arbitrary relation between words and objects, or words and their meanings. And so we can call this signification, actually. But he also uses it in a different sense to refer to a non-arbitrary relation between ideas and their objects. And given that we are concerned here with mental representation, as Lauren said, with the relation basically of our ideas to the world, this is the kind of representation, or this is what I will call representation henceforth, and it's the kind of representation that I'm interested in for the purpose of this talk. So the second thing virtually everyone agrees on, you have here a long but not exhaustive list of people who I take to agree with that particular feature of Berkeley's notion of representation. This feature, namely, is that he endorses a resemblance-based account of representation. I have here a quote from the manuscript introduction, section 12, which nicely illustrates what Berkeley takes to be, or what, according to Berkeley, is a resemblance-based account of representation. In this passage, he contrasts representation in a strict sense with signification. And he writes, "But it is not so with ideas in respect of things of which they are supposed to be copies and images. they are not thought to represent them any otherwise than as they resemble them. Whence it follows that an idea is not capable of representing indifferently anything or number of things, it being limited by the likeness it bears to some particular existence to represent it rather than any other. So I think from what Berkeley has to say, it's pretty evident that he thinks or believes that representation necessarily requires resemblance, and thus that there is a difference between resemblance and representation. And while this is pretty clear, I think it's unclear what this difference amounts to in detail, because precisely because the complexity of Berkeley's notion of likeness has hitherto not been really appreciated. So tongue-in-cheek, but really tongue-in-cheek, one could say that many commentators, myself included, when they attribute the resemblance-based account to Berkeley, do not really know in detail what they're actually attributing to Berkeley. So to resolve this issue, let me first talk a little bit about resemblance. So one feature that you find in Berkeley, and which is probably adopted from Locke, but we can talk about it in the Q&A if someone is interested, is that early on in his notebooks, which he wrote between 1706 and 1708, which that is shortly before the publication of the New Theory of Vision or the Principles, he suggests, or there are several entries that suggest that there is a really close connection between resemblance and acts of comparing. And Peter West, for instance, has pointed out that this is less prominent in his published works, such as the Principles, but nonetheless, there are instances where he draws attention to the importance of comparing. One of these instances you find in section 104 of the Principles, where Berkeley writes, "Indeed, if we take a view of the several phenomena and compare them together, we may observe some likeness and conformity between them." So what I take Berkeley here to point out, at least implicitly point out, is that the act of comparing is at least a necessary condition to discover whether a likeness relation exists. I actually think it's more, but that's also something to talk about in the Q&A. I think a lot of these instances where he talks about comparing hints that or can be taken to suggest that he thinks that comparing is actually necessary to constitute the relation. But if we take a more conservative approach, it seems, at least to me, pretty evident that he thinks that acts of comparing are necessary to discover such relations. So it's at least an epistemological claim. Good. The second thing, or the more pertinent thing that resemblance requires, according to Berkeley, is, and this is not really surprising, it requires that two things actually agree in at least one respect. So we have here a nice bit from the Principles Introduction, section 22. There he writes, "It is not possible for me to imagine that any of my own ideas are alike or unlike that are not truly so. To discern the agreements or disagreements there are between my ideas, there is nothing more requisite than an attentive perception of what passes in my own understanding." So this is really a nice quote because it draws together the two things I have mentioned. So first of all, Berkeley makes this connection between being alike or being unlike and agreeing or disagreeing in a certain respect. And then also implicitly, he draws this connection to the act of comparing when he talks about the discerning of these agreements and that you only need to attentively consider or attentively perceive your ideas. And I take it that the reason that Berkeley thinks that we can always correctly discern this agreement and that that all it requires is an attentive perception is that these agreements or the respects in which those things are alike is actually independent from us. And while Berkeley does not really say so, this is strongly suggested by the fact that he believes that there is a state of things in rerum natura, that is a state of things that does neither depend on us for its existence nor its nature. Exactly. And so what he's saying in principle, in the introduction to the Principle, is basically that the act of comparing, that is the attentive perception, helps us to observe, that is discern the commonalities that are between, or the the commonalities that are between our ideas, so the agreements or the disagreements. So the act of comparing helps us to discover the likeness relations there are. Good. With this, let me turn to the three groups of resemblance relations, because if we follow Berkeley's advice and attentively consider our ideas in a basically Berkeleyan mindset or state of mind, and accepting his metaphysics, then we will come to the conclusion that there is something which I call generic likeness, and that obtains. So this is a kind of likeness or a group of likeness relation that obtains between all ideas in virtue of their passivity. So this passivity claim you find all over Berkeley's work. I have here a nice bit from Principles section 25, where he writes, all our ideas, sensations, or the things which we perceive by whatsoever names they may be distinguished are visibly inactive. There is nothing of power or agency included in them. Whoever shall attend to his ideas, whether of sense or reflection, will not perceive in them any power or activity. So again, Berkeley thinks that all ideas, and really all ideas there are, they agree at least in one respect, namely that they are passive. And this is precisely, or this is also something he points to when he says that the essay of all ideas is percipi. However, if we look more closely at our ideas, or the Berkeleyan way of dealing with ideas, you realize that there is at least one more group of likeness relations, and this I call specific likeness. And this kind of, or this group of likeness relations obtains between all ideas of one sense modality. So I have here a quote from Principles 1, where it becomes evident that Berkeley distinguishes between the ideas or the perceptions of the different sense modalities. So he writes, by sight, I have the ideas of light and colors with their several degrees and variations. By touch, I perceive, for example, hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and all of these more and less, either as to quantity or degree. Smelling furnishes me with odors, the palate with tastes, and hearing conveys sounds to the mind in all their variety of tone and composition. So our five sense modalities are concerned with five different actually kinds of ideas. And it's really, so it's important to note that this is really a strict distinction between those different kinds of ideas, or that the ideas of one sense modality are really different. So because Berkeley endorses what is standardly called the heterogeneity thesis. For instance, in regards to the ideas of sight and touch, he writes in the Principles that they are two species entirely distinct and heterogeneous. And I take it, I mean, that's also something we discussed, but I take it that this applies to all kinds of ideas of sense. So the ideas of sights are heterogeneous to the ideas of touch, smell, and sound, and so on. And so, but the flip side of this is basically, so while they are heterogeneous compared with each other, they are homogeneous when we consider them as a group, or as I will call them, they are specifically alike. So all of them agree in being ideas of light and colors, for instance, when we talk about the ideas of sight, and that they are that we perceive them by sight. These are respects in which this group of idea and only this group of idea agrees. Good. So we already have seen two groups of likeness relations, and we have also seen that Berkeley distinguishes between different kinds of what is often called ideas of sense. But when it comes to, so far we were not at the point where we could talk about representation and the relation between ideas and the world. And for this, we need to consider four additional things. And the first one, the most important one, is that Berkeley distinguishes between ideas of sense, that's the ones I was talking about, or I have been talking about, and ideas of imaginations, or ideas of imagination. And now, crucially, for my purposes, the ideas of sense, according to Berkeley, they do not represent anything. They are actually the real things. They are what all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth is composed of. And so only this is point 3 here, only the ideas of imaginations are actually images of things, which they copy and represent in Berkeley's world. That is, only ideas of imaginations are ideas of something. And also important to note concerning these ideas of imagination and the question of representation is that they require an act of imagining to exist. And by this, Berkeley means something like remembering, combining, or dividing previous perceptions we had. So with this in mind, let me turn to the third group I'd like to distinguish, and this group I call natural resemblance. And now natural resemblance obtains between an idea of imagination and the idea of sense. It is an image, resemblance, or likeness of. And now what's interesting here is that in virtue of requiring an idea of imagination, or the fact that natural resemblance requires an idea of imagination means that this group or this kind of resemblance relation depends on us as finite beings in a unique way. Because as I pointed out, the ideas of imagination need an act of imagining to exist. So the whole relation actually needs the perceiver to exist, in as much as one of the relata only exists if there is an act of imagining. However, when it comes to the content of the relation, so not the relata, but the actual content of the relation, this resemblance relation is as independent of us as are the others. Because the reason for this is that the other relata, the idea of sense that is copied, is given in the state of things in rerum natura, as we have seen, and also, or the same goes for the respect, which is copied. So if we have an idea of imagination of a particular color, this color is given in the state of things in rerum natura, and the same goes for the particular shade of this color, for instance. So now, tying those things together, the crucial thing to note is that because since only ideas of imaginations are ideas of something, only they are concerned with mental representation, or mental representation is concerned with ideas of imagination. And as I just pointed out, or according to my reading, then representation necessarily requires natural resemblance. And while generic and specific likeness are of some importance, they are only of a secondary importance for Berkeley's notion of representation. So according to the distinction that Berkeley draws, it holds that everything that naturally resembles is also specifically and generically alike, but not everything that is generically alike, as for instance, ideas of sense, or all ideas of sense, they are generically alike in virtue of being passive, but not all of them are specifically alike because of the heterogeneity thesis. And not everything that is specifically alike, such as the ideas of one sense modality, does naturally resemble. Because natural resemblance needs an idea of imagination to obtain in the first place. So, in conclusion, when we want to draw or understand more precisely what the difference between representation and resemblance is in Berkeley, I think we can say the following. So resemblance to Berkeley is the relation that can obtain between ideas, or the ideas of one sense, ideas of sense, and ideas of imagination. And also, I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but I'd be happy to discuss this in the Q&A. Resemblance can obtain between ideas of imagination and even between minds or relations. And resemblance relation to obtain requires an agreement of the relata in the state of things in rerum natura, and an act of comparing to be discovered, and possibly even to be instituted. Now, representation, on the other hand, is the relation between the ideas of imagination and their objects, which are usually ideas of sense in Berkeley's immaterialist system. And this particular relation requires natural resemblance. And in virtue of requiring natural resemblance, so here we have the necessary conditions, it requires an agreement of the relata in the state of things in rerum natura to exist, an act of comparing to be discovered, and because we need to create the idea of imagination in the first place, it also requires an act of imagining. And so we have differing, the necessary conditions of resemblance and representation are somewhat similar, but also slightly different. And yes, with this, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the final panelist who will complete our journey to the theories of mental representation in early modern Europe.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Manuel. It's really fascinating. So we'll turn now to our third speaker. Dr. Peter West is currently a teaching fellow at Durham University in the United Kingdom. His dissertation, which he received from Trinity College Dublin recently, focused on the thought of George Berkeley. He's subsequently developed projects relating to Margaret Cavendish, Susan Stebbing, and as we'll hear today, Anton Wilhelm Amo. Peter is also a winner of the Turbain Prize, and you can find some of his recent publications in the Journal of Scottish Philosophy, the Journal of the American Philosophical Association, and other venues. So today, Peter will speak to us about Amo on ideas and representation.
Great. Thanks very much, Patrick. And thanks again to the Princeton-Bucharest seminar for having us. It's great to be talking with Manuel and Lauren about this topic. Can you see my screen? I mean, I keep asking that after a year and nobody's ever said no, but I'll continue to ask it. Or 18 months or however long it's been. Okay, so I'm talking about Amo and his answer to the question, how does an idea represent its object? So there's three things I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so. I want to basically lay a bit of groundwork, say enough about Amo's metaphysics and philosophy of mind that you can follow what I'm talking about. I also then want to introduce the state of the interpretive debate, i.e. the secondary literature focusing on Amo's account of the human mind to date, and then basically suggest that we take it in a slightly different direction. And so that's the third part of what I want to do, which is to make the case for thinking that Amo defends what we might call a functionalist account of mental representation. One thing I'll be interested in is what people think of this label, because obviously that has connotations of 20th century philosophy of mind, but hopefully it'll become clear why I'm giving it that label. But if you think I shouldn't, that would be good feedback for me. Okay, so without giving too much kind of introductory stuff about Amo, these dissertations that he produced in the 1730s have a central thesis, and it's him responding to Descartes. And his response is interesting, particularly in light of what Lauren was saying about Descartes. But Amo thinks that a significant problem arises from, at least as he sees it, Descartes' view that it is the mind and not the body that has sensations of things in the world around us. So to cut it very short, Amo's reasoning looks something like this. The mind is always active. To have a sensation is to be acted upon passively, and so not to be active. Therefore, the mind cannot possibly have sensations. And via a process of elimination, which starts with the assumption that it's either the mind or the body that has sensations, Amo then, on the basis of this, argues that it is the body that has sensations and not the mind. And so that his first dissertation focuses, as he puts it, on the impassivity of the human mind. Okay. Whoops, that quote has come too early. He offers this definition of a spirit. So for Amo, a human mind is a kind of spirit. And this is his definition of a spirit. any purely active immaterial substance which is always in itself understanding and operating spontaneously and intentionally on account of a determinate end of which it is conscious. And then, as I said, the human mind for Amo is a specific kind of spirit. And here's his definition of the human mind, which you see is similar, but also there's an important difference. The human mind is a purely active and immaterial substance, just like every other spirit, by commerce with the living and organic body in which it is present, understands and operates from intention on account of a determinate end of which it is conscious. Okay, so the human mind does the same thing as every other spirit, but it does it through a body, and there's the difference. So as I said, for Amo, the human mind is a particular species of the genus spirit. So this is just a bit of background, but if you've got a spirit in front of you for Amo, you can begin to ask some questions that will help you work out what kind of spirit it is. So you can ask, is it in commerce with a body? And this is Amo's particular piece of terminology referring to the relation between mind and body. If the answer is yes, it's a human mind. If the answer is no, there are other questions you can ask. For example, you might ask, is it a finite spirit or an infinite spirit, or is it God? Well, if it is God, then it is God. And if it isn't, then it might be a spirit of an angel or of the deceased. So Amo talks about spirits of the blessed or the damned. Okay, so I think that's enough background to be making sense of what I want to say in the next 10 minutes. So moving from Amo's account of the human mind to the state of the interpretive debate so far. So when it comes to Amo's views concerning the human mind, most commentators, or at least most recent commentators, focus on this kind of question. Where do ideas come from? Or how are ideas in the mind generated? Something like that has been the focus of most of the secondary literature focusing on Amo's account of the human mind. And this interpretive question arises because of Amo's commitment to the purely active nature of the mind, which rules out what we might think of as interactionist models of mind-body causality. So the kind you might think is endorsed by Descartes, and the kind of account of mind-body relation that someone like Princess Elizabeth has an issue with. So given Amo's own commitment to the purely active nature of the mind, the question arises, where do our ideas come from? They're not caused by the pineal gland or by sensations in the body. And some commentators have argued that Amo's account of the mind-body relation is, as Justin Smith puts it, broadly Leibnizian. So on that account, we're talking about pre-established harmony between mind and body, and no actual interaction. It's a tempting reading, given what we've seen about Amo already, also given the time at which Amo is writing. But I think it faces problems in light of Amo's claims about what he calls the commerce between mind and body. I'm not really going to say much about this, but basically, my point is that when you read Amo, it seems like the mind and the body are more closely connected and related to one another than they are for someone like Leibniz. Other commentators have argued that Amo adopts a model of occasional causation, where bodily sensations are occasions for either the mind itself or perhaps God to cause ideas in the mind. I mean, there's not a lot of literature on this, but the consensus, if there is one, is that it's occasional causation and that probably the mind is the cause of its own ideas. Although Julie Walsh suggests it might be something more Malebranchian where God is the cause. Okay, so what's the point of what I'm saying here? Well, it's really just to show that there's a rich, albeit still relatively small, debate about how ideas arise in the mind for Amo. But what I think is nonetheless the case is that the precise nature of the mental representation that then takes place once ideas are in the mind remains unclear. So, coming back to that question, how does an idea represent its object? As we'll see, Amo's commitments, his views concerning the mind and the body, make this an equally difficult question to answer, which I think suggests there ought to be a similar interpretive debate taking place. So there's three commitments that make it difficult to answer this question: how does an idea represent its object on Amo's behalf? So first of all, Amo argues that the mind and the body, and in turn, ideas in the mind and sensations, which as we've seen for Amo exist in the body, are heterogeneous. So he describes the mind and the body and the contents of the mind, the contents of the body, as contrary opposites. And so what that means is that what the mind is like and what the body is like are completely different. In fact, that they're opposite to one another. And so this rules out what we might sort of anachronistically call an internalist resemblance model of representation, the kind that someone like Berkeley has, as Manuel was telling us. As we've seen, for Amo, the body cannot causally interact with the mind. So this rules out, again, I'm being anachronistic, an externalist causal model of representation. So the two accounts that Lauren was suggesting Descartes does not accept, it's also clear Amo doesn't accept either of these sort of relatively standard accounts of mental representation either. And then on top of that, Amo, interestingly, for someone who is for the most part a Cartesian thinker, so he's a substance dualist and toes the line with Descartes and other places, he adopts the peripatetic axiom, which is the claim that nothing in the intellect, there's nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses, which is more often associated with empiricist thinkers like Locke. And that seems to rule out Amo having a theory of innate ideas, which I think kind of casts some doubt on the extent to which Amo is Leibnizian when it comes to ideas. Okay, so how does an idea represent its object? It's a difficult question to answer when you put these three things together. There's no resemblance, there's no causation from body to mind, and there's no innate ideas. Okay. Moving on to the third part of what I want to do, try and answer that question. So what is Amo's account of representation or mental representation? In short, as I've said, my contention is that Amo adopts what we might call, or what I'm calling for the time being, a functionalist model of mental representation. So on this model, ideas represent not by virtue of their content or as images, nor by virtue of their causal history, but by virtue of the function they serve, which is an analogous function to the one served by sensations in the body. And that's important. So Chris Baines writes, Amo hints at a principle of isomorphism as the basis for sensory representation. I think that sounds about right, but I want to just go a bit further and explain how that pans out. So on the reading I'm attributing to Amo, representation from mind to bodily sensation might look something like this. So a sensation of pain, say if you stub your toe, might alert the rest of the body to bodily damage and elicit a response. So that's the function that the sensation is serving. Meanwhile, the idea of pain in the mind serves a similar function and allows me, and when I talk about me here, I mean the mind, to decide whether a further response is needed. So there's two different roles being played or functions being served. Now, at that point, you might reasonably ask, okay, if there's no causation from body to mind for Amo, how does this work if sensation doesn't cause ideas? What Amo says is that the mind attends to, in other words, makes itself aware of bodily sensations and then causes ideas itself. So I'm kind of largely in agreement about the origins of our ideas in the mind. with other commentators who think it's something like occasional causation. So the bodily sensation is the occasion for the mind to act. Okay, so here's a toy example, just to try and make it clear what it is I'm talking about. So the body has a sensation, say a sensation of pain. The mind actively attends to this sensation. One thing I should note, for Amo, it's perfectly possible for the mind to act upon the body. So he's got an asymmetric account of causation when it comes to mind body. So this necessarily doesn't involve that, but just to make that clear. This, having attended to the sensation in the body, this serves as the occasion for the mind to actively, again, not passively, generate an idea that serves an analogous role. So for example, alerting me to bodily damage. So Amo talks about, so he describes ideas as setting up as present sensations. And I'm just adding a hypothetical if here, because I think in the spirit of what Amo is doing, it's true to say that what the mind does is sets up an idea. What it does is puts itself in a position as if it were having sensations, which it isn't because it's an active entity. So it's setting up as if present a sensation. And that's an idea. So these pain ideas come to represent pain sensations because they play this analogous role. Okay, I'll finish off in a moment. So since we're doing history of philosophy, we obviously want some textual evidence for what I'm attributing to Amo. There's other things I could point to, but I think this passage in Amo's treatise, which is his the last work that we have access to of his, is quite helpful in that regard. I'm just going to move myself out of the way so I can read it. So he says that in us which can represent something to itself is called the mind. That whereby it represents something to itself by means of instruments is its representative act. That which it represents to itself as an object is sensation, which remains in the sensory organs and the memory. Okay, so he's committed to that distinction between the mind, which is the thing that represents, and sensations in the body, which are the things which are represented. The mind is that which represents something to itself, and it does so via these representative acts, which necessarily involve the body. That's quite important. I mean, I haven't really said anything about this, but Amo thinks that representation is a uniquely anthropological activity. So he says, for example, there's no representation in God. Here we have Amo reiterating his commitment to the peripatetic axiom. And then he says, such a sensation represented is called an idea. So an idea is what happens when this process takes place. And this is the part which I think is helpful for the view I'm trying to attribute to Amo. So the representative act of the mind is, of course, a function of the mind, but represented and representable sensation is a function of the body. The former in the sense that the intellect is a faculty of the mind, the latter in the sense that the faculty of sensing is a faculty only of the body. So here we have Amo explicitly committing himself to there being these two functions being, or these two roles being played, one in the mind, one in the body. So the mind and the body and the representative act and represented sensation respectively have these parallel functions. And on the view that I'm attributing to Amo, mental representation takes place when these, well, mental representation happens when these functions both take place in sync. But what's important to note is just this is something the mind instigates. So just to, again, push away from the Leibnizian reading of Amo. It's not something that was always there, these two functions. It's something that the mind instigates. Okay, just to finish off. I think if there's any truth in what I'm saying, it sheds new light on Amo's epistemology, which is important. You know, it's still a thinker we don't know a huge amount about. It also, I think the conclusions of this are significant because they suggest, contrary to a somewhat caricature view of early modern representationalism, which people like Thomas Reid and Bertrand Russell are guilty of propagating, it's further evidence that there were sophisticated ways of thinking about representation during the period. And it's another case for why we ought to pay attention to thinkers who have traditionally received very little scholarly attention. All right. Thank you very much for listening. And again, I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's really wonderful. So just a reminder about the way we have just about an hour for question and answer. Just a reminder, if you have a question for one of the speakers, please just indicate that using the chat function. Please also indicate who you'd like to address your question to. So it looks like, Allison, you have a question for all of them. Go ahead, fire away.
Well, I don't want to hog the floor, so
You were first off the mark, so go for it.
I know, but who should I start with? Let me start with Peter, since we just heard Peter. And I'm so well. First of all, congratulations to all three of you for such interconnected talks. That was really kind of cool. So Peter, two questions really. One I just can't remember. Do bodily sensations themselves represent? And, of course, we're thinking pain. No, pain doesn't represent, but, even a blue sensation presumably is happening in the eye. And second, why isn't the representation of the ideas even simpler than you suggested? It sounds like a straightforward exhibition model, right? Why isn't it the case that what the mind is doing, it attends to the sensation and it just exhibits that sensation to itself? So it doesn't have a sensation, but it's exhibiting it. That'd be a simpler way to go. That's my question for you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, interesting questions. Thanks. The first question, do bodily sensations represent? I think the answer for ammo is no. So an idea is that which represents, and that which represents is an idea. But that's an interesting question about whether, is the image in the retina representing that which caused it? Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I guess what I would say is he maybe has a different account. He's got one model for mental causation, mental representation, and one model for represent, and that's not too unusual. Like Manuel was saying, we have these distinctions between signification and representation and so on. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that though. The other question, why isn't it a more straightforward model of representation where an idea simply exhibits its object? So it might be that this notion of representation via exhibiting, is this, I mean, I'm not totally familiar. I'm not as familiar with someone like Carr as I am with, someone like Berkeley, for example. So I don't know if this is a particular terminology that is found in the literature on Descartes. So that, if it is, that might be helpful for me. But I guess what I would say is, it seems to me like the commitment to ideas being heterogeneous from sensations makes it difficult to understand how that would work, but maybe I'm missing out on something. So it's unclear to me how you could exhibit, but maybe this is the empiricist in me talking, but it seems unclear to me how you exhibit something with something else when the two have nothing in common, when the two are not alike.
I guess the tricky question is, can something active present to itself something passive? You've probably got the Berkeley worry in the back of your mind.
Right.
But you might think, as long as it's generating the thing, I can draw a picture of my pain and I'm active with respect to that. But I'm there by creating something that presents the pain to me. Either I'm not undergoing the pain in doing that. And that's what I'm most concerned about. But I've still got access to it. Just a thought.
Yeah, I guess to me it seems so Amo, when he, by committing himself, and it's really the central thesis of most of his writing, that the mind cannot be passive to the body. I mean, there's a suggestion, people like Julie Walsh have thought maybe minds can be passive to other minds, because but that's a different thing. But so there's no route from body to mind for anything. There's no content could be preserved when you go from sensation to mental representation. So to me, that provides a reason for thinking it's got to be, and that's why I think it's more like some kind of isomorphism, as Chris Maines puts it. That there might be the structure of things might, or at least the way I'm putting it is like the role they're playing might be preserved, even if the content of things isn't. I hope, does that make some sense?
Super.
Okay, I'm going to kick the floor over to other people, and you can come back to me if you run out of questions.
I've got you on the list. That's super. Hanak, do you want to ask a question to Lauren?
Yes, thanks very much. I have about 50 questions to all participants, but I'll start with one to Lauren. It's a question comment. We have discussed a little in the past. I'm not sure that Descartes thinks about signs and language as a representational medium. In fact, I have a paper which I'm now revising for publication in which I discuss this. I've combed the corpus, and he never says about signs or words that they represent. And there's a small question to Manuel here also. Manuel, you mentioned two kinds of representation in Berkeley. The first, you said, i.e. signification, that's words. And does he call it representation too? I'll continue with Lauren now. If we go to the world passage, first chapter, I think that I think the argument there is not very clearly put. He improves on it in the principles part 4 towards the end, where you have a new version of a revised version of the argument, and it's clearer there. And his effect about the world passage, a bit later in that first chapter, he, in order to support his point, he mentions the pain caused by a belt or something pressing against the body, and even the ticklish sensation produced by an idea that we move on a child's lip. Now, and all these examples serve the same purpose. Now, in the case of the feather, say, the ticklish sensation does not represent the motion of the feather. So if everything here serves the same purpose, including words and thoughts, then all that is important for him there is that the words or signs do not resemble the idea. And there's no concept of words representing things, which I think, I find it only in Wittgenstein's Tractatus and later. Perhaps I don't know someone in the 19th century, but not in those thinkers of the 17th century. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, I obviously this is something that we have spoken about, and yeah, I'm familiar with the paper that you're talking about too. So I guess what I want to say is that whatever's happening in the brain that's being compared to a word, yes, it doesn't represent in the same way that an idea has sort of representational content, but I want to say that it has a kind of derived meaning, just in virtue of the fact that it's associated with an idea that has kind of original meaning, or I don't know if those are the right terms to use, but hopefully the point is sort of clear enough. So yes, it's true that words don't have the power to represent sort of by themselves. They only kind of have the meanings that they do in virtue of the fact that they sort of cause or quasi-cause us to have the relevant ideas. So I want to say that the same thing is kind of going on with the union. So the idea is that the brain is connected to the ideas in the mind, and in virtue of that connection, there is sort of a kind of derived meaning in the brain as well. yeah, I guess what I think is significant is that Descartes doesn't talk about he doesn't talk about signs. He talks about words. And to me, there's something sort of in that. It sort of seems like, well, he's chosen words for a reason. They're a specific kind of sign. And they do have this kind of power in virtue of the fact that they're instituted to have this kind of derived meaning. That's sort of what I want to say. But we should talk more about this for sure.
Yes, I agree. I'll just mention one more thing before dropping this. And this is something I added to this work of Manuel's. I mean, in this first book, The World, Treatise on Light, is not a treatise on representation and on meaning. It's a treatise on light, on material nature, and so on. He hardly mentions representation there. Only in that first passage once. And he talks a lot about representation in L'Homme, because there the brain, etc., represent. So, well, there's lots of material here, but it's an important fact that light is not a treatise on representation, while man is. And in light, the important thing is that the ideas need not be like what causes them. Mm-hmm. But this does not say that what you said is right or wrong. It's just another factor to take into consideration. Okay, we'll continue it. I stop here. But if Manuel can say something about signification, representation, about words in Berkeley, does Berkeley ever say that the words sign represent or only signify?
So really briefly, he does say so, yes, explicitly. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that a lot, but especially in the manuscript of the introduction, he really says the difference between the way that words represent and that ideas represent their objects. But for some reason, this does not make it to the published version. But most people, myself included, would agree that this is not because he ceases to believe that there is this difference. And when it comes to he often draws this analogy between when he talks about his divine language, that ideas of sight represent the same way as words do. And as I have tried to convince people in my dissertation, this has to be taken pretty literally. So yeah, I'd say there are a lot of instances where he really uses represent instead of signify. But of course, there's also talk of signification and signify.
Super. Todd, do you have a question for Manuel?
Yes, thank you. My question is about the handful of passages in Berkeley where he talks about how two composite perceptions from different senses, heterogeneous, can be more fit to represent each other because of I think he says, conformity of parts, what we might now call structural isomorphism. So there are these passages where he basically says, well, yes, the visible square could have represented the tactile circle, but the visible square is more apt to represent, or more appropriate to represent, the visible square because of this similarity of parts. You know, each has four components. And so my question for you is, how do we fit this into the three categories of resemblance that you're talking about? I mean, should we think of this as a fourth kind of resemblance? Should we think of this as a kind of natural resemblance or a species of natural resemblance? Or is this a kind of relation that we shouldn't be thinking of in terms of resemblance at all?
Okay, thanks, Todd. Great question. As per usual, when you ask me a question, I'm not entirely sure about the answer, but ad hoc, I said it's at least three groups of likeness relations, and I think I'm convinced there is at least one more which obtains between relations. So I would be in principle totally open to add another group or another layer, because it would be in a way grits to my mill, because it would even further demonstrate or illustrate how complex Berkeley's thinking about likeness actually is. But yeah, maybe I should not be too liberal in expanding this notion. But I haven't thought about these passages in a long time, and but they are actually really pretty pertinent to the fact, because there it says stuff like being liker or more of a species. So it arguably what you say would pertain or could pertain specific likeness, for instance. And I mean, another avenue to pursue would be to basically to say, or to try to cash this out in saying, okay, maybe this is a consequence of what specific likeness is, or this is a way that you can cash out what homogeneity or specific homogeneity, specific likeness will amount to, and basically again this flip side, right, that you have this isomorphism of parts or yeah, I mean, in the end, the isomorphism of I think you could cash it out this way. So I would well, I would have to think about it more if I would add another group or try to cash this out in terms of specific likeness. But given just as a quick side note, I mean, in the notebooks, Berkeley says, for instance, pretty explicitly says what the ideas of sight, for instance, have alike is that they are of light and colors, and that they are intromitted by sight. So these are the respect which he names, and saying that saying that the structure, or that this also has an impact on their structure, as it were. I think that would be in line with this.
Great, thank you.
I think I'll abuse my position as chair and ask a question to Lauren and to Peter. So I think that for Lauren, I'm really sympathetic to the idea, right, that, you know, what's the relationship between the ideas and the motions of the brain, and it's something instituted by God. But I think you're absolutely right. We have to say a lot more about this, you know, and these are divinely instituted with a purpose. And one of the purposes that sort of came to mind for me was something about preservation of mind-body union. And so I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit about that. And it's also a question for Peter, because I guess I was thinking about what it would mean for there to be an isomorphism between something that happens in the body and something that happens in the mind. And I guess I was worrying about the degree to which heterogeneity was going to make it difficult for there to be isomorphisms if they're genuinely full contraries. But if there is this commerce, or if what's really important about human minds is their commerce with the body, you know, maybe there are avenues there for thinking about preservation of mind-body union, and so maybe there's some resources. So it's a question for both of you.
Should I go first? Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really nice thing to be invited to speak about, because it's not something that I touched on, but it's obviously important to what I'm saying. But yes, absolutely. I think that for Descartes, as he makes clear in the sixth meditation, the purpose of our sensory ideas is to keep the body safe, right? It's so that we can kind of navigate ourselves around successfully. And so I think there's a lovely story to tell. As you just said, that God institutes these connections between what's happening in the body, specifically the brain, and the ideas that we have as a result in order to keep us safe and healthy. And so it's a sort of, it's a method of communication, or it's a language instituted with that purpose in mind. So I totally agree. I think that makes sense of why God would do this, for as much we can reason about God's purposes, which as we all know, we should not.
Good question, Patrick. So it's right. So I took the question to, yeah, can there be a genuine isomorphism between two things that are contrary opposites? I mean, I guess this is kind of similar to the question that Todd was asking Manuel, which is structural similarity? Is that resemblance? I don't know what the answer to that is. So to give a bit of context, so two things I didn't mention in the presentation, but which got me thinking about this question in ammo. One is, he says that, as I said, I did say at some point, he says that the knowledge via ideas is unique. This isn't me paraphrasing him, is uniquely anthropological. So he said, or at least he says, there's no representation in God because there's only representation where there's something absent. And there's nothing absent in the mind of God. So there's no representation. So it's only humans that know via ideas. So it's definitely something to do with the mind-body commerce, or at least it's pretty reasonable to assume that, because what makes humans unique is that they have this commerce with a body. The other thing that got me thinking about this is at some point, Amo approvingly cites, I can't remember his name, but a scholastic thinker who says something like sensation is a matter of likeness, or something like that, which sounds, I mean, that's like kind of a spanner in the works when he spent a lot of time talking about how the mind and body are different. So that got me thinking, like, is there another way of thinking that two things can be alike that isn't the same way that like a portrait is like its subject? Is there something? And that's where I think this structural similarity thing comes in. Yeah, so I don't know whether that's a really roundabout and not very much of an answer to the question, but that's some thoughts I have on that question. Can there be an isomorphism between two contrary opposites? I mean, I think basically it's a matter of putting together the commitments and working out what Amo's view has got to be, because he thinks the mind and body are in this commerce, but he also thinks they're contrary opposites. And ideas play this key role in providing us of knowledge of that which is on the other side of things, i.e. the body and the material world via the body. And maybe it's the case that Amo's still, it was really prevalent amongst the scholastics that cognition and representation works via some kind of likeness. So maybe it's a case of Amo working out, how we should think about likeness in a coherent way when we're talking about two very different things.
Yeah, super. That's great. I'd forgotten about that passage about we only need representation when things are absent. That's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to Warren as well. That's super. Alberto, you have a question for Manuel?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I really enjoy your talks. Wow, Descartes, Berkeley, and Amo was really good panel. But my question is for Manuel. Reading your conclusions, the conclusion, the difference between representation and resemblance. The first condition in both cases is, you said, it's an agreement of the relata in the state of things in rerum natura. So my question is, when you are thinking in that agreement implies, according to your reading, implies some kind of objectivity in knowledge, and particularly some objectivity in representation. And if so, how you posit it and how we can reach that objectivity. And that's my question and my doubt, Manuel.
Good, thank you very much, Alberto. Okay, so as I suggested, I'm not entirely, so you could call this what I now had here a pretty realist reading, and you cashed it out in terms of objective, right? And I actually favor more what Walter Ott has termed conceptual foundationalism in his reading of Locke and Locke's notion of relation. So that I think actually the relations are not that objective. They're somewhat a halfway house in between something that's objectively there, because Berkeley believes there is a world which is independent of us, but that we as perceivers actually have a pretty important job to do when we relate these things to each other. So I actually believe that from God's point of view, the world is structured, yes, but from the point of view of finite minds, it's basically not structured at all, and it's part of the job we have to do as perceivers to structure the world. And as you then can see in different language communities, we actually do structure the world slightly differently. So I cannot really defend that objectiveness claim too hard, because I don't really believe in it, and I actually think that the act of comparing I mentioned is not just merely that Berkeley is not making a merely epistemological claim there, but that he actually believes that comparing is also a necessary condition for the relation to obtain. And in that sense, our interests and abilities also factor into a degree into the content of the relation. So I usually try to say that the relation has some objective foundation. So we cannot, so it's not, what I don't endorse is a really straightforward anti-realism. It's not like, or I don't think Berkeley thinks that anything you can compare is alike. But actually that the world sets your acts of comparing certain boundaries, but we have some leeway in what we do compare and what kinds of likeness relations, in virtue of comparing these things, we institute.
No. I just I was wondering, because also a topic that I'm interested, in what kind of objectivity we have in the perception, as a perceivers, and after that we can, find the objectivity in others, or how can we can agreements, of perception, and that's why my question, and but all this is problematic. And well, thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, I really think it's pretty complicated, and basically that God gave us a playing field, more or less. So he gave us certain boundaries, but within that playing field we have some liberty.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is an objective foundation to it. So it's not entirely subjective. It's really a halfway house. It's not entirely objective, but it's also entirely subjective.
Mm-hmm.
So.
No, I agree, but well, we need probably 30 minutes more or more. 2 years more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It seems to me there's always a danger with these conceptualist foundationalist views that in an effort to get the best of both worlds, you end up with something unstable in between them. But we'd need a half hour more, sorry. So anyway, David, you have a question for Lauren and Peter.
Yeah, thanks guys. It was really fascinating. So I guess I'm the one responsible for Manuel including those qualifications that virtually everyone agrees about, the resemblance thesis being endorsed by Berkeley. But I have questions for Lauren and Peter. These are just very basic clarificatory questions. I think, Lauren, you suggested that the theory Descartes adopts is a sign theory, and it is different from a causal theory. And I was wondering why you think that, because it seems really compatible when people talk about semantic causal models. And so, yeah, maybe we can go in turns, I guess.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I can definitely say more about that. So I think I do think there's some kind of causation or causal-ish thing going on. So I take the view that Descartes allows for occasional causation to exist between the body and the mind, which I think is a species of causation and is obviously distinct from occasionalism, sort of Malebranche style. So I think that much like words, in fact, I think the sort of the language thing kind of helps here as well. When we see or hear a word, an idea is sort of brought to mind, but it's important that we already have that idea in order for the word to have any effect whatsoever, right? So you need to know the idea and you need to know the association with that word before the word kind of occasions that idea. And I think that kind of fits with what Descartes says about the fact that these ideas are innate. These ideas have to kind of pre-exist their occasions. So what I don't think is the case is that the body brings ideas into existence. So causing in that sense, causing as in bringing something into existence, I don't think is what's happening. But occasional causation, which I think, as I say, sort of is just a species of causation for Descartes, I think is at play. But I think it's important that the ideas already have their content. So the other thing is, that I don't think that that anything that's happening in the body is giving the idea its content, right? The idea exists with its content, and whatever happens in the body is merely an occasion for that idea to be kind of brought to the forefront of the mind. But that's it. Does that make sense? So there's definitely something causal going on, but
yeah, definitely. Actually, this is related to the question I wanted to ask Peter about. So I thought the causal model can be, it's kind of an answer to this one as well. But Peter, you kind of excluded the more standard models, right? Like the causal, or the externalist and the internalist, right? And basically for the reasons just Lawrence said here, right? So the body couldn't cause anything in the mind, but I thought it's a quite standard scholastic model that the content is somehow dependent or determined by the physical process and by the object. But it's based, I guess it's the exhibition model, I guess, or related to that. So it's a mind who does the thing, but what you do or what you want to represent is determined by what is happening outside. Otherwise it would be really chaotic, right? So I wasn't sure if Amo should be committed, denying a causal model in this weaker sense. And I also wasn't sure if you need to reject the internalist model just because there is heterogeneity, and it of course relates to Manuel's talks. It's all, related to everything, because it can mean resemblance in what I like to call in nature, so the stuff. And if you talk about representations, it might be it's something about the vehicle of representation, but not necessarily about the content. So someone might say that, of course, the vehicle is really different from the stuff outside. That was the standard Cartesian view, I guess. But the content is somehow still can still resemble, and Amo, I guess, could say something like that. So I'm just rambling, but yeah.
Yeah, right. I was just going to say, just before I answer that, I was just going to say, it's interesting because Amo obviously doesn't read Descartes as having a theory of occasional causation. He really thinks that for Descartes, bodily or that sensation happens in the mind, and I think Amo's reasoning for that is that he thinks Descartes ties sensation and passion together and is pretty explicit about passion happening in the mind. So that's, yeah. So, but it was interesting because as you were presenting your reading of Descartes, I was like, oh, this is going to bypass all of Amo's concerns. But yeah, so that, yeah, right. So there's a scholastic model where something like the content of the content of the thing represented makes its way into the mind, and I guess for some people it's like the form of the thing or something like the Aristotelians. And why can't that be Amo's view? I mean, so this isn't really an answer to the question, but I think something that's super interesting about starting to look in more depth at theories of representation in the early modern period is that there's like lots of thinkers are like constrained in some way by something they seem to have inherited from scholastic thinkers, which is that in some kind of loose sense, representation involves resemblance, but then there's like loads of different ways of understanding how resemblance works. And I think that to some extent Amo is also caught in that. Like, he is trying to work out how, in some kind of loose sense, what's in here can be like what's out there, because to present something, you know, whatever's presented, I don't know. Yeah. So I don't think it can be. I think his opposition to the scholastic model would be, so his reason for thinking the body cannot act upon the mind is, he says there's three ways that a body can act upon something: communication, penetration, and I think it's contact. So it's actually quite similar to the types of concerns that Princess Elizabeth has with mind-body interaction, where she says, like, given that interaction works like this, I would more easily understand the mind-body interaction if you said they were the same kind of substance. So I think Amo would say, and I think it's communication would be the important one here, where he says modes or forms can only be communicated between bodies. Like a body couldn't communicate a mode or a form of itself to a mind. So I think that would be his opposition to the scholastic view, like really broadly construed. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, I think in the same way as Lauren answered it, I think you have a stronger meaning, a sense of causality than I do. So I think if something is an object presented to you, is a cause of your perception, and that's
okay. So I guess the more specific way of putting it would be to rule out maybe an efficient causal account of representation.
Yeah,
but that's definitely committed to that. Yeah. Whereas causation, more loosely construed, might be what's at work, and I think that's consistent with his talk of there's commerce between mind and body, but there isn't interaction. So it's like there is some kind of relationship, like in a loose sense, one is doing something to the other, or the sensations in the body are getting the mind to do something, which is generate ideas and represent things to itself. So in that sense, there's like a causal relationship, but it isn't like if to be a bit like simplistic about it, it isn't like the body could get the mind to do something it didn't want to do, if you like. You know, the mind's always doing something voluntarily.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I understand as the scholastic model. Actually, so it's not the efficient cause; it's something else, however you want to call it. It's
Super. So I see a question from Vili for Lauren.
Yes, thank you all for the great talk. So I'd like to ask Lauren a bit more about the signification model, and in particular how it handles how Descartes saying that when I'm thinking of the sun, there's really the sun existing in the intellect, and Descartes talk about objective being that I am hosting as I'm thinking things. So that seems that there's somewhat more robust metaphysical relation to the things that I'm thinking about than maybe the signification model. I mean, at least by first glance could accommodate. So I'd like to invite you to say more about that.
Yeah, thanks. The tricky sun passage. I guess one thing I can say is that Descartes talks about more than one idea of the sun, and one of those ideas is the one that we get from the senses, which is a small bright disk in the sky, or whatever he says. So I suppose that since I was talking in this presentation quite specifically about our sensory ideas, and so insofar as the sensory idea we have of the sun is this sort of small bright disk in the sky, then that sort of is as he acknowledges, dissimilar to the actual sun, which is very big and, you know, far away and whatever. Yes, that's one thing I can say. I guess it is a sort of tricky passage, and I don't want to sort of not do justice to sort of how many people have tried to interpret this passage, but I guess I am happy that you know, the ideas of the sun that I have, the various ideas of the sun that I have, are all kind of the sun in some sense, but that there is also something that exists, that exists sort of in the extended world. There's something that is extended, you know, in length, breadth, and depth, and is wherever it is. That I guess the relation between that and my ideas of the sun is that it, you know, moves my body in such a way so as to produce some particular pattern of movement in my brain, so as to occasion that sensory idea of the sun. And then there's some other idea that I have in the intellect of, you know, the sun and its dimensions and various sort of, I don't know, mathematical things. I guess I'm revealing that I don't really have this idea of the sun. But there's that one as well that I suppose has its relation to the material sun, because well, I suppose just because God determined it. So, you know, it's that's it. That we have this sort of mathematical idea in the intellect, and that just is what it is, and it represents what it represents. And then we have this sensory idea, which also has this kind of connection to the brain. Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Okay, super. I see in the chat, Margaret has given us a text from the New Theory of Vision, and Bill has said something. I think these were related to the question that Todd had for Manuel. Margaret or Bill, does either of you want to say something, or should we press on?
Mine was actually a question for Lauren.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry. Do you want to go for it?
Just really quick, unless Margaret. Okay. It just seems like God could have made mental effects resemble their physical causes. So is the lack of resemblance a deception?
Yeah, also a good question. So I guess
also
that...
I really enjoyed all three presentations. They were just incredible. I could talk about this stuff for hours.
Yeah, so can we. We could have filled up like 5 hours with all that content. So the deception question is a good one. I guess that, you know, Descartes' explicit answer to this is that we experience sensations in a more, well, in this sort of very immediate way, so that we kind of actually do something about it, right? So if my hand is near something that's really hot, I'm going to move it away because I have this sort of very immediate, painful sensation. I guess that's his sort of explicit answer. But I think that the whole language thing has some relevance here as well. So I like to think of it as the difference between sort of, you know, reading words without understanding their meanings or something like that, you know, maybe a language that you're really unfamiliar with, that you're just learning. So you might sort of see a series of symbols on a page, and, you know, the response to that is not going to be as immediate as reading a word and just immediately having its meaning. And so that kind of, to me, seems like it captures some of the difference. We don't, you know, the whole sailor in the ship thing, we don't kind of observe the damage to our bodies. It's something that we are immediately sort of a part of. And that the language thing kind of captures that for me as well. I think that once when you kind of inhabit a language, the distinction between the meanings and the words just blurs. And and it all is it all happens sort of almost simultaneously. So yeah, I don't think it's a deception. I think it's the best possible system that could have been devised in order to preserve our well-being.
Okay, thank you.
Super, thanks. So I think we're on to the, I apologize if I've skipped anyone. I think we're on to the second round. So Alison, you showed restraint last time. Do you want to jump in again?
Sure, I'll ask a really quick one for Manuel. It's a question about specific likeness. What about touch? I mean, hot and cold don't seem to have any likeness to like rough and smooth and hard and soft. And what do we do about it? I mean, this may be a problem for Berkeley rather than you, but it's an interesting feature of touch that it doesn't play nice.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I would agree. It's a problem for Berkeley. No, but I think the story there. I mean, obviously, he doesn't give a straightforward story. He confines himself to sight when he says when he highlights the way in the ways in which this group is similar or homogeneous. So, I mean, the only thing I can say he has to be, because of all the things he says, he has to be committed to that what we would take to be as rather apart sensations or a rather heterogeneous set of sensations is actually a homogeneous group. And I mean, it's basically what he calls touch is more or less proprioception, you would probably call it nowadays. It's just for him, it's a catch-all term, and it does play a really important role in the end when it comes to the divine language. Then so. But I mean, at least all of them would agree, at least to the Berkeleyan story, that they are perceived by the sense of touch, even though there are some difference in between them. But I mean, one could also say there are differences in between green and red, for instance. Nonetheless, both of them are colors, and what they agree in is that they are perceived by sight. And I would guess that probably Berkeley could go down that route as well. Also, when it comes to, I mean, tastes, for instance, we distinguish between sweet, sour, and so on. And one could also say, okay, but that seems to be rather different. So, but I would just then claim, or I would still say this is grits to my mill, that if you pursue this further, that there are probably, even within specific likeness, there are probably subgroups, or that we can even distinguish subgroups. And this also goes along the line of what I was saying to Todd, that even for example, when it comes to our visual ideas, that there might be, or that we even have to pay attention to the structure, and that this would allow us to even create further diversions, which all would go to show that, yeah, I mean, the one thing I could be charged is that that Berkeley doesn't really articulate these things, but it's more or less his writings that allow to articulate these things. But I would still hold that there's a lot of complexity underneath what seems to be a pretty easy story.
I guess what I wonder is, why does he need specific likeness? I mean, that he has heterogeneity, he needs specific heterogeneity, but does he need specific homogeneity at the same time?
I would not see how he could get one without the other. I mean, okay, you could say they are heterogeneous, but they are not necessarily alike. But the fact is that he, and I mean, I hinted at there being a discussion whether the heterogeneity is even extended to all the heterogeneity is really extended to all the senses. But given what he says about the ideas of sight, so and if you believe that he extends it to all the senses, mutatis mutandis, because there he seems to be pretty explicit about there being that this is really a united homogeneous group. And even names, I mean, albeit only in the notebooks, but he names agreements that they share. He even specifies those agreements. So yeah, one could argue that he seems, if he extends it to all the senses, he seems to committed to considering each of the ideas of sense as a homogeneous group.
Super. So we have just a few minutes left. We haven't heard from Peter in a bit. Hannah, do you want to ask Peter your question?
Right, I'll do that. Thanks. It's about animals. Since Amo puts the sensation back into the body, do animals have sensation in the full-blown sense for him? Or if they have some lesser spirit, is there anything about that? Is there anything in him, in his writings about it? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so Manuel has asked me this question before because he likes animals these days. So there may be something in the treatise, which is a longer piece of writing, which I haven't read all of. So that's the caveat. But as far as I know, he doesn't talk about animals. But I think that you're right, that there's a really interesting implication of Amo's view. Because I mean, what Amo's doing, at least according to his reading of Descartes, is giving back some of the stuff that had been, purely the jurisdiction of the mind and putting it in the body, right? Like pain sensations and whatever it is that comes with those, contemporary terminology, qualia and so on, right? That's in the body. And then the mind is like much more intellectual and is about understanding those, doing something with them, acting towards an intention in response to them and so on. So I think,
it's intentionally active too. So
the mind,
the mind's intentionally active in a way that animal sensation would be purely passive. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, you're right. But I do think that there's, I mean, compared to, I mean, and everything I say about Descartes, right, is like the standard reading of Descartes, which is probably not very nuanced. But compared to Descartes, he's giving more back to animals, right? They don't seem to be just automata. They seem to be, they're having sensations, whatever sensations are. And I think that, all I would say is I just think that's interesting, the implications of it. I don't know if he actually says anything about it. He probably doesn't, because he's like, he's not an overly systematic thinker. The two dissertations are focused on the mind-body relationship and how to understand it. The treatise is more like it's closer to something like the Port Royal logic. It's like got these, it's about ideas and knowledge, and you can draw a systematic metaphysics or whatever out of that, but he isn't doing systematic philosophy.
Thanks very much.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I hope everybody will join me again in giving a huge round of applause and huge thanks to our three speakers. This has been absolutely delightful. I know I can speak on behalf of Lauren, Peter, and Manuel in saying that if anybody has follow-ups, they'd love to hear from you by email, and they're very easy to find online and easy to contact. So I'll say once again, thanks to our organizers. And this is where I've realized I should have looked and seen what's up next week. But I
can say something about that.
Please.
Thank you, all three of you, for a lovely session, extremely lively discussion. This was really lovely. Next week, we're going to have a panel on Emily de Châtelet with Clara Carras, Aaron Wells, and Annelise Ray. And you're all welcome to come and participate. But again, thank you very, very much for a really lively session.
Can I just say thanks to Patrick for agreeing to chair and helping us put everything together and so on. He's been a good sounding board for the whole thing as well. So thanks, Patrick.
My pleasure. We'll see everybody hopefully next week.
Yes.